Imagine you're deep in the Alaskan wilderness, where the icy winds cut through the towering pines, and the only sounds are the crunching of snow underfoot and the occasional distant call of an eagle. Here, in a quiet, untouched expanse, a small team of scientists had come to study one of nature's most majestic, mysterious creatures, the grizzly bear. They'd arrived prepared, armed with knowledge, equipment, and the thrill of new discoveries that every biologist dreams of. But there was one thing they hadn't prepared for. They didn't expect that a single bear would lead them to an experience so extraordinary, so deeply moving. It would leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about these fierce animals, and about themselves. The story begins on a brisk, misty morning. With the sun barely rising over the snow-capped peaks, the team spotted their first bear, a massive, golden-furred male who looked like he ruled these woods. His steps were slow and deliberate as he lumbered over rocks and logs, his head held high as if he knew he was being watched. The scientists held their breath, completely mesmerized as the bear scanned the area before dipping his snout into a river to catch his breakfast. This was their moment. The researchers knew that bears were powerful, territorial, and highly intelligent, but what they didn't know was that today would be different. Today, they were about to witness a side of this grizzly that had never been documented before. Hours turned into days, and the team became familiar with the bear's routine. They observed his fishing, his napping spots, and even the way he'd scratch his back on a particular tree, as if it were his own personal scratching post. Each member of the team grew attached in their own way, each silently marveling at this creature's independence, his raw strength, and the unspoken connection that seemed to grow between them. They had never seen a bear quite like him, and despite their scientific approach, they began to feel something that was almost like kinship. But there was still so much they didn't understand. And then it happened. One evening, as the team watched from a distance, the bear seemed different. He wasn't just going about his routine. He moved slowly, his head hanging low, his steps heavy. The researchers exchanged glances, uneasy but unable to look away. Suddenly, the bear let out a sound, a long, low, mournful cry that echoed through the trees. It was a sound none of them had heard before, and it sent chills down their spines. The bear seemed to look up, his dark eyes filled with something that almost looked like sorrow. What had caused this mighty creature to cry out in such a heart-wrenching way? What had they stumbled upon? As the sun dipped below the mountains and the shadows deepened, the scientists knew they were about to embark on an emotional journey they could have never anticipated. But nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to uncover. The secrets, the connections, and the shocking revelation that would forever change how they understood not just this bear, but the entire world of these incredible animals. And so, with bated breath and hearts racing, they took a step closer to find out. As the team pressed forward, they tried to make sense of what they'd just seen. Bears, after all, were creatures of survival, finely tuned by nature to be resilient and fierce. The idea of one expressing any emotion, especially sorrow, seemed strange, even unthinkable. Yet here they were, watching a wild animal display something that felt eerily close to human sadness. Each member of the team was buzzing with questions, and an unsettling silence fell over the group as they tried to figure out their next move. What could they do? How were they supposed to study this strange behavior? But the bear seemed to have other plans. As the days passed, the team noticed the bear acting in ways that continued to defy their expectations. He stayed near the same area by the riverbank, refusing to wander far from it, though it offered little shelter or food. He'd walk up and down the edge of the water, his massive paws leaving prints in the mud. And sometimes he'd stop and look out across the river with that same look in his eyes, a kind of searching, a lingering sadness. Sometimes he'd sit still, his gaze locked on the opposite shore, his entire being seemingly lost in whatever he was watching for. The researchers could only watch in fascination and frustration, unable to understand what was keeping him there or what he was looking for. Dr. Emily Reed, the head researcher, couldn't shake the feeling that there was something they were missing. She'd spent her career studying wildlife, dedicating years to understanding the behaviors of wolves, lynxes, and, of course, bears. And yet she'd never seen anything like this. Every night, as she reviewed the footage they'd gathered and went over her notes, she felt the same nagging question haunting her thoughts. What was going on in the mind of this bear? One evening, as the team gathered around their makeshift campfire, Emily decided to bring it up. "It doesn't make any sense, does it?" she asked, looking around at her team members. "We're all seeing it. He's not behaving the way we'd expect. But why?" Her assistant Tom shook his head, stirring his mug of coffee absently. "Maybe it's just some kind of territorial behavior? I mean, it's possible he's trying to stake out this part of the river." Emily frowned, still unconvinced. "But we've seen him catch fish and just leave them. He's not marking his territory the way we've seen other bears do." And that cry. She trailed off, recalling the sound that had haunted them all since they'd first heard it. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't even a warning. It sounded like pain. The youngest team member, Sarah, spoke up, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you think he could be mourning?" The word hung in the air, a concept so foreign to their research that it took a moment for everyone to process. Mourning. The idea of a bear experiencing grief was something they'd never even considered. But as the silence stretched, Emily's mind drifted to a story she'd heard years ago about an elephant in Africa that had refused to leave the spot where its companion had died. Could it be possible, she wondered, that this bear, too, was mourning? And if so, what or who could he be mourning for? The next day, Emily decided to follow the bear even more closely, determined to understand the mystery behind his behavior. With a quiet resolve, she and Tom took to tracking him at a cautious distance, careful to stay out of sight. They watched as he moved along the riverbank again, his powerful muscles rippling beneath his thick fur as he stepped, hesitated, and looked out across the water with that same forlorn gaze. Emily had studied countless animals before, but this was something different, something personal, almost like watching a close friend go through a heartbreak. Then, just as she was about to turn back, the bear's head lifted, his ears pricking up, and he let out another one of those mournful cries that seemed to echo off every tree and rock around them. The sound chilled Emily, even though she'd already heard it once before. It was raw, primal, filled with an emotion she could hardly bear to define. And then he turned and looked directly toward her and Tom, as if he knew they were there. The intensity in his eyes was undeniable. They both froze, watching, waiting. Emily didn't dare to move, feeling as though this moment was far too important to break. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the bear's attention shifted. He turned his back on them and moved back toward the trees, slowly disappearing into the thick shadows of the forest. But as he vanished, Emily felt a strange, almost unshakable sense of connection, as though he'd shared something with her in that fleeting glance. She looked at Tom, who seemed just as taken aback, and they walked back to camp in silence, their minds racing with questions. Over the next few days, the bear continued his silent vigil by the river, returning again and again to the same spots, and each time the team would watch him, hoping to catch a clue, a sign, anything that could help them understand. It was as though the bear had become a mystery they were all desperate to solve, and yet the more they watched, the more questions they had. One morning, Sarah, who had been meticulously scanning through the footage from their cameras, came running toward the group with a look of excitement and confusion on her face. "You guys have to see this," she said, barely able to contain herself. She plugged the footage into their laptop and hit play. On the screen, they saw the bear at the riverbank once more, but this time something was different. A shadowy figure appeared on the opposite shore. It was just barely visible, but it looked unmistakably like another bear. The team watched in stunned silence as the two bears seemed to acknowledge each other from across the river. The grizzly they had been following let out a low rumble, a sound that was neither aggressive nor fearful. The other bear paused, then turned and disappeared back into the trees on the opposite bank. Their grizzly watched until the other was out of sight, then lay down on the riverbank, resting his head on his paws with what looked like a resigned acceptance. Tom broke the silence. "So, it's another bear. But why would he act like this? What's keeping him here?" Emily's mind was racing with possibilities. Perhaps the other bear was a former companion, a family member, or even a rival. The only thing she knew for certain was that this encounter had triggered something profound in the grizzly they had been watching. The revelation left them with even more questions and an urgency to dig deeper into the mystery. For the next several nights, the team continued to observe the strange ritual, watching as their bear kept his place by the river, waiting for his shadowy visitor. Each time the other bear appeared, their grizzly would let out the same low rumble, a sound that now felt unmistakably like a call, a gesture of longing. Yet every time, the other bear would come just close enough to be seen, and then slip back into the shadows. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, and the team knew their time in the wilderness was running out. But no one was ready to leave, not with so many unanswered questions, not with the sense that something truly extraordinary was unfolding right before them. They could only wonder what had drawn these two bears together and what force kept them apart. As the sun set on their final night, the team gathered for one last observation. They watched, their breaths visible in the frigid air, as their bear took his place by the river once again. This time, the scene felt more somber, as though both he and the mysterious other bear sensed that their time was nearly up. The bear lifted his head, and for a moment Emily thought she saw something in his eyes, a glimmer of hope or perhaps acceptance. But then, just as he let out his call, the bear on the other side of the river turned and disappeared into the shadows, this time for good. The team watched in stunned silence as the bear let out his final call, his low, rumbling sound carrying across the river and fading into the cold night air. They waited, holding their breath, half expecting the other bear to return, to step out from the shadows and answer. But nothing happened. The silence stretched on, broken only by the gentle flow of the river and the occasional rustle of the trees in the wind. Emily felt her heart sink, sensing that this was different, that the quiet this time was final. But the bear didn't move. He stayed there, lying down at the river's edge, his head resting on his paws, staring blankly into the dark forest on the other side. His body seemed to sag with exhaustion, as if the weight of all those silent, unanswered calls had finally taken their toll. Emily felt a pang of empathy that surprised her, an understanding that went beyond science or research. This bear wasn't just waiting. He was mourning, feeling a loss so profound that even the wilderness around him seemed to mirror his sorrow. The team exchanged uncertain glances, wondering what they should do. Sarah looked at Emily, her eyes wide with both fascination and concern. "Do you think he'll leave now?" she whispered, not wanting to break the spell of the moment. Emily shook her head, feeling an unsettling mix of certainty and dread. "I don't think so," she replied quietly. "I think he's here for a reason, and whatever it is, he's not ready to leave it behind." The next morning, as the first light broke over the mountains, they found the bear in the same spot, unmoving, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. He looked smaller, somehow, as if all the life and power that had defined him were slowly fading. It was a sight that filled the team with a sense of urgency, a feeling that they were running out of time to understand this story, to grasp the meaning behind this powerful connection that had held him captive on this lonely riverbank. Emily decided they couldn't just keep observing. They had to try something different. She proposed setting up a hidden recording device along the river, hoping that if they left the area and gave the bear some privacy, they might capture any interactions between him and the mysterious other bear. The rest of the team agreed, though they were reluctant to step away. For days, they'd been immersed in the bear's story, feeling an emotional connection to him that went beyond any data or scientific curiosity. As they returned to camp to set up their equipment, the team noticed something unusual. Scattered along the riverbank, half hidden in the mud, were remnants of bones, small and scattered but unmistakably from an animal. They were old, weathered, and broken, as if they'd been there for years. Emily's pulse quickened as she carefully knelt beside them, examining their delicate structure. She recognized them as bear bones, possibly belonging to a young bear. A disturbing thought flashed across her mind. Could this be the missing piece of the puzzle, the reason for the bear's vigil? Tom, noticing her reaction, voiced what they were all thinking. "Do you think... could he have lost a cub here? Is it possible?" Emily didn't respond right away, still studying the bones, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. She had heard stories before, accounts from rangers and researchers, of animals mourning the loss of their offspring, staying near the place where they had last been. But to see it here, in front of her, was something different. This bear's sorrow was almost palpable, a raw, lingering grief that defied all scientific explanation. The pieces were slowly coming together, but there were still gaps in the story, unanswered questions that haunted the team. Why had the other bear appeared? Was it a family member, perhaps another cub that had survived? And why did it always vanish into the forest without any apparent response to the grieving bear's calls? The mystery hung heavy in the air, filling them with a strange, electric anticipation. They needed answers, but they also sensed that the truth, when it came, would be something they couldn't easily walk away from. The following night, they set up the recording equipment as planned and withdrew from the area, hoping that their absence might encourage the bears to reveal more of their secret. They waited anxiously in camp, each hour stretching longer than the last, filled with a tension that made sleep impossible. Finally, as dawn broke, they returned to the river to retrieve the footage, their nerves tingling with anticipation. Back at camp, they huddled around the screen as the footage began to play, the quiet sounds of the forest filling the speakers. For a long time, there was nothing but the bear lying by the riverbank, his gaze fixed on the distant trees. But then, just as they were about to give up hope, they saw the shadow appear again, moving silently across the opposite shore. The other bear stepped forward, just enough to be seen in the dim light. And then, something unexpected happened. The shadowy bear lifted its head and let out a low, mournful call, echoing the one that had haunted the team for days. The team watched in stunned silence, unable to look away as the two bears continued their silent exchange across the river. This time, however, the shadowy bear did not disappear into the forest. It lingered, moving closer to the water's edge, as though drawn toward the grieving bear on the opposite bank. The tension in the air was almost unbearable, a strange magnetic pull between the two animals that seemed to transcend anything they had ever observed in the wild. And then, in a moment that sent shivers down their spines, the shadowy bear crossed into the water, stepping carefully over the rocks until it stood just a few feet from the grieving bear. The two animals faced each other, their eyes locked in a gaze so intense that it seemed to hold all the unspoken emotions and memories between them. The team held their breath, hardly daring to believe what they were seeing. Just when it seemed like the moment could stretch on forever, the grieving bear lifted his head, his eyes glistening with something that looked almost like understanding. And then he let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound that was neither angry nor sad, but filled with a quiet, deep acceptance. It was a sound that seemed to convey everything he had held in for so long, a release of the sorrow and longing that had kept him there by the river. But as the other bear moved closer, lifting a paw as if to bridge the distance between them, something unexpected happened. As the two bears stood face to face, separated by only a few inches of rippling water, the air was thick with anticipation. The team could hardly believe what they were witnessing. A connection so deep, so filled with mystery, that it seemed to transcend the wild instincts that usually kept animals wary and distant. The shadowy bear's paw hovered over the water, almost as if reaching out to touch the grieving bear, to offer comfort or a silent goodbye. The team watched in stunned silence, feeling as though they were intruding on a moment far too sacred, far too intimate for their presence. But then, just as the shadowy bear took another step forward, a sharp, crackling sound echoed from somewhere nearby, a sudden snap of a branch. Both bears froze, their ears pricking up, their bodies tense. The team's collective heartbeat seemed to stop. They scanned the forest, squinting into the shadows to see what had caused the noise, each of them holding their breath, as if any sound they made would shatter the delicate moment. Out of the darkness, another figure emerged. A third bear, its massive form barely visible in the faint dawn light. This bear was larger, older, with a fur coat streaked with gray and scars that traced across its face, hints of battles long past. It lumbered forward with slow, deliberate steps, its gaze fixed on the two bears by the river. There was something fierce, almost ominous in the way it moved, as though it carried a purpose known only to itself. The team felt a chill run down their spines, sensing the weight of something they didn't fully understand. The grieving bear shifted, its body language tense as if recognizing this new bear and the history that came with it. The shadowy bear backed up slightly, its eyes darting between the older bear and the grieving one, as if caught between a deep-seated fear and a pull that kept it rooted there, unwilling to leave. The tension was palpable, thickening the air around them as all three bears stood in an uneasy triangle, connected by something invisible yet undeniable. Emily's mind raced, her thoughts jumping from theory to theory. Could this new bear be an elder, perhaps a parent or a former rival? Or was it something else entirely? A figure tied to whatever tragic event had driven their grieving bear to remain on this riverbank. She could feel the weight of the unanswered questions pressing down on her, a desperate need to understand what was happening before her. Every instinct she had screamed to intervene, to somehow protect the bears from whatever unknown history lay between them, but she knew she couldn't. This was their story, one that had to unfold naturally, no matter how it ended. Then, without warning, the older bear let out a growl, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to reverberate through the entire forest. It was a sound filled with authority, almost a command, a demand for attention. The grieving bear lowered its head, its posture shifting from defiance to reluctant submission, as if acknowledging the presence of an elder. But the shadowy bear's stance was different. It stood firm, its gaze defiant, unwilling to retreat or acknowledge the authority of the older bear. The team watched in stunned silence, feeling the tension mount as the scene before them took on a life of its own, a story of unspoken conflict and unresolved ties. Suddenly, in a move that took everyone by surprise, the older bear lunged forward, crossing the remaining distance between itself and the grieving bear. It didn't attack, but it moved close enough to force the grieving bear back a step, as though asserting a silent dominance. The grieving bear looked up, its expression unreadable, its posture both wary and respectful, as if it owed something to this older bear yet resented the debt. The shadowy bear let out a low, protective growl, inching closer, positioning itself between the older bear and the grieving one, an act that spoke of loyalty, of some bond so strong that it was willing to challenge even a more powerful bear. The team exchanged wide-eyed glances, their hearts pounding, caught up in the raw, primal drama unfolding before them. Emily felt her hands clench into fists, unable to tear her eyes away from the scene. This was more than a reunion, this was a confrontation, a reckoning. Whatever connection bound these bears together, it was laced with conflict, history, and something else that was both thrilling and heartbreaking to witness. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the older bear stepped back, its gaze shifting, a hint of something softer crossing its scarred face. It let out a low grunt, a sound that was neither aggressive nor gentle, but held a strange, mournful resignation. For a moment, it seemed as though the three bears were locked in a silent conversation, one too complex for human understanding, but filled with layers of meaning that the team could only guess at. The grieving bear looked away, its head bowing slightly, its body language filled with a sadness that seemed almost unbearable. The shadowy bear moved closer, its presence comforting, protective, as though silently promising to stay by the grieving bear's side, no matter what. But the older bear wasn't finished. With a final piercing look, it turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. The grieving bear watched, its expression shifting between sadness and relief, as if witnessing the end of something long awaited, something painful yet necessary. The team held their breath, sensing that they had reached the turning point, the moment where everything they had observed would finally come to a head. Just as the older bear vanished from sight, the grieving bear let out a single heartbreaking cry, a sound that filled the air with an intensity that sent chills down their spines. It was a cry filled with everything the bear had carried all this time, a release of sorrow, longing, and loss that seemed to echo through the very heart of the wilderness. The shadowy bear moved closer, pressing its head against the grieving bear's shoulder, a silent gesture of comfort, of solidarity. The team was left breathless, overwhelmed by the weight of what they'd just witnessed. The forest fell into silence once more, and as the first light of dawn spread across the horizon, the two remaining bears stood together by the river, their silhouettes framed against the morning sky, connected by a bond that defied explanation, a story that had taken them beyond the limits of science and into the realm of the unknown. Just as Emily and her team began to grasp the enormity of the moment, a new realization dawned on them, a question so powerful, so haunting, that it left them rooted to the spot. Had they been mere observers, or had they somehow been part of this story all along? As the morning sun stretched its first rays across the river, Emily and her team found themselves drawn even closer to the grieving bear and its silent companion. The shadowy bear, the one who had appeared again and again over these tense days, was now closer than ever, pressed against the grieving bear in a way that felt more significant than any vocal exchange. The scene had a kind of reverence, the stillness of it only heightening the emotion that seemed to ripple between the two animals. But something changed. Just as the bears seemed at peace, as though they had finally laid their silent conflict to rest, a movement in the shadows caught the team's eye. It was the older bear again, but this time it did not approach with authority. Instead, it circled back to the riverbank, keeping its distance yet clearly unwilling to leave entirely. There was a strange sadness to its stance, a look that seemed to convey regret or guilt. The grieving bear noticed and tensed, its body language shifting from relief to something sharper, more guarded, as if an old wound had been torn open. The shadowy bear stepped protectively in front, almost challenging the older bear, its loyalty fierce and unshakable. Emily felt her pulse quicken, an instinct telling her that the final truth was on the verge of being revealed. She watched the older bear's every move, trying to piece together the story that had been unfolding in front of them. What history could be so strong, so raw, that it would bind these animals in such an emotional knot? The answer lay in the silence, in the looks exchanged between the bears, a language without words but filled with meaning. Then, in a moment that sent shivers down everyone's spine, the grieving bear stepped forward, confronting the older bear. It let out a sound that was both angry and mournful, a voice filled with years of pent-up emotion. The older bear's head dropped, its posture shifting to one of submission. And then it happened. The grieving bear made a move that no one expected. It reached forward and touched the older bear's shoulder with a gentle nudge, a gesture that seemed almost forgiving, an acknowledgement of something deeper than anger or loss. But as the team watched, trying to make sense of the scene, a final, unexpected twist revealed itself. The shadowy bear, the one who had always stayed hidden, stepped forward closer to the grieving bear. It let out a soft sound, one that was neither aggressive nor submissive, but filled with quiet strength. Slowly, the pieces of the story started to fall into place. Emily's breath caught as the truth finally dawned on her. The shadowy bear wasn't just an onlooker or a passerby. It was the offspring of the grieving bear, the cub that had survived whatever tragedy had unfolded on this riverbank long ago. All along it had been watching, waiting, bound by an unbreakable bond to the place and the bear that had mourned for it. This wasn't merely a story of grief, it was a story of reunion, of family that had been divided and was now coming together, even if in bittersweet circumstances. The older bear, as Emily now understood, had somehow been involved in that tragedy, a witness, or perhaps even the cause. Whether by accident or choice, it had altered the course of the grieving bear's life, leaving it tethered to this spot, to a memory that it could never let go. And now, with the return of its lost cub, the grieving bear had come full circle, finding peace in the reunion it had longed for all this time. In an intense, final moment, the grieving bear let out a sound, a soft, almost contented sigh, one that echoed across the river and into the quiet forest beyond. It was a sound that marked the end of an era, the closing of a chapter. The two bears, parent and offspring, leaned into each other, united in a way that transcended all the pain, all the loneliness that had kept them apart. The older bear, seeming to understand its place, turned and slowly disappeared into the forest, leaving the family to their newfound peace. The team watched as the grieving bear and its child stood by the river, their silhouettes framed by the gentle glow of dawn, as if the wilderness itself was offering them a moment of quiet absolution. The story had come to its end, a resolution so powerful that Emily and her team felt changed by it. They had been witnesses, yes, but more than that, they had become part of a tale that defied all logic, all explanation, a story woven from bonds that ran deeper than science could ever explain. And as they turned to leave, giving the bears the privacy they deserved, they felt a quiet understanding settle over them, a feeling that they had witnessed something extraordinary, something rare and unforgettable. In that final, parting glance, as they looked back at the two bears by the riverbank, Emily knew one thing for certain. There were stories in the wilderness that would never be fully understood, mysteries that would remain hidden in the depths of nature, in the bonds between creatures who spoke without words, who understood each other in ways that humans could only dream of. As the team made their way back through the forest, the weight of the story they'd witnessed still hung heavily in the air. They moved in silence, each person lost in their own thoughts, replaying the emotional journey they'd experienced. Emily glanced back one last time, catching a final glimpse of the grieving bear and its offspring, standing side by side at the river's edge. In that quiet moment, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, as if they had all been given the closure they didn't even know they needed. Back at camp, the team gathered around the fire, too moved to speak at first. Each of them carried a mix of emotions: relief, sadness, awe. Tom broke the silence, his voice low and filled with wonder. "I never thought I'd see anything like that," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I mean, it's one thing to read about animal behavior in a textbook, but to witness it, it feels like we were part of something sacred." The others nodded, each one grappling with a similar feeling. They had come here as scientists, but what they had experienced had reached beyond the realm of research. It had touched something deeper, something that couldn't be measured or explained. They had seen grief, loyalty, forgiveness, all the things they thought only humans could feel. And yet, here they were, forever changed by what they had witnessed in the lives of these wild creatures. Emily, still processing it all, took a deep breath and finally spoke. "We're always so focused on categorizing, explaining, defining everything we see. But maybe some things aren't meant to be understood. Maybe they're meant to be felt." She looked around the circle, seeing the emotion mirrored in her friend's eyes. "I think we've been given a gift. A reminder that the connections between living beings, no matter the species, are complex, deep, and sometimes beyond our understanding." The team nodded, each of them quietly absorbing the weight of her words. They had come expecting to observe nature, to collect data, but they had found a story far richer and more profound than they'd ever imagined. They realized that sometimes the most powerful discoveries in nature aren't about solving mysteries, but about recognizing the beauty of things that remain unsolved. Over the next few days, they continued their work, capturing footage and gathering observations. But there was a change in how they approached each moment. They were no longer just researchers. They were witnesses, storytellers, carrying with them a tale that would remain with them for a lifetime. Every time they heard a distant call echoing through the trees or saw the outline of a bear moving through the shadows, they were reminded of that morning by the river, of the bond between the grieving bear and its child. When it was finally time to leave, they packed up their equipment with a quiet reverence, each person feeling as though they were leaving a piece of themselves behind in the wilderness. As they began the long trek back to the base, they walked slowly, each step carrying a sense of gratitude, of respect for the land and the lives that called it home. Once back at the research station, they reviewed the footage they'd gathered, watching the scenes unfold on the screen. They saw the bears' final reunion, the raw emotion etched into every moment, and felt the impact all over again. But as they watched, they noticed something new. A glimpse of the older bear watching from a distance, its eyes filled with a sadness they hadn't noticed before. Emily paused the footage, staring at the screen as if searching for answers, wondering what story lay behind those eyes. It was a reminder that even in the wild, there were histories and emotions woven into the fabric of life, connections that could never be fully understood. The team decided to release their findings, sharing the story of the bears with the world. But instead of a dry scientific report, they presented it as a narrative, a story of love, loss, and reunion in the heart of the wilderness. Their research paper became a testament to the bonds that animals share, a call to recognize the depth of emotion and connection that exists in the natural world. Their story went viral, reaching people across the globe, touching hearts and inspiring a new perspective on animal behavior. As Emily and her team saw the response, they realized the true impact of their journey. They had shown the world a side of nature that was often overlooked, a side that resonated deeply with people. They had brought awareness to the idea that animals, too, experience emotions, that their lives are filled with stories as rich and complex as any humans. And in doing so, they had created a bridge, a connection between humans and the wild, reminding people that we are all part of a larger tapestry of life. Years later, Emily would still think back to that time in the forest, to the morning by the river, and feel the same awe, the same reverence. She would go on to share the story countless times, each retelling a tribute to the bears and the lesson they had taught her. And every time she told it, she would end with the same words. A reminder to those listening to look beyond the surface, to see the depth of connection that exists in all living things. In the end, the story of the grieving bear became more than just an observation. It became a legacy, a story passed down through generations, reminding everyone who heard it of the beauty and mystery of the natural world. And as people listened, as they felt the weight of the tale settle into their hearts, they were reminded that sometimes the most profound truths are the ones that can never be fully explained.